The criminal war on David needs to be uncensored in its relevant issues in order to engage in the legal proceedings for the court without the obstructions by the Confederate orders, which actively support its own magic fraud against American security. Specifically relevant in the uncensored version, you have such necessary confessions, such as their belief that the character for David Bowles, having been established in his original series of layered prosperities, would have developed for himself advantages over secrets which the government would view as vital in order to keep secret, and the only legal means of providing the maintenance of those secrets is to pay David off in the original cause when he was a toddler. At the systematic position, you have to understand that the fee would have required them to have established David Bowles as a general of the United States, to engage in the study of deeper secrets, and engage in missions of highly classified and secret mechanisms in that development of the study of state secrets. And with the proceedings as being an obligation for them to provide him this mechanism, many of their strategies are specifically derived by the frustration that this is their core belief. And seeing as how that is a fundamental thing that they are incapable of renouncing as a foundational truth, they have actively sought the destruction of David in the various poison scripts in order to divert away from that action under the assumption of his absolute success and victory in these functional espionage Civil War actions. And these Civil War actions, by the secret clause, engaged in terrorist attacks against the general public and the overthrow of the popular government, legally elected without the subversion such as substantive voter fraud. These series of secret functions include the list of legitimately obstructed missions that they felt that David Bowles would have gone through, which they would have arranged to be suicide missions, which, if they had felt would have been successful, they would have invested in. And qualifying the assumption of his success engages in the active development of alternative poison scripts in order to achieve the means by censorship, abuse, restraints, containment, subversion, human trafficking, and sabotage of every variation in their Fruit of the Poison Tree script written by morons significant of nothing. A list functionally of their criminal interests, qualifying all of the actions that they are guilty of, signifying the counterweight to their belief of insignificant and inferiority. Now, the qualifier being generated to a higher degree signifies our necessary observation of these missions, which, having mostly being censored legitimately, would, even in the case without the obstruction, still mostly be classified, and thus unable for us to legitimately go over in an unclassified setting, or in the rare exception where it is necessary for the public to know, as would have to be certified by the proper authorities and courts, would cover systematic subversions against the United States actively being defeated, such as their mission as insurgents to do 9/11 as an inside job, which is exactly how it worked. The Confederates in the Greater War on David, which have subcontracted sub-policies specifically designed to defeat the United States and its projected leadership, qualified that the destruction of the mission to create 9/11 as a functional policy certified their engagement of a series of wish lists of powers and wars, qualifying the illegal wars, which was an extension of their previous wars in the Middle East, which have already been engaged with, and the 90s wars in the Middle East, as opposed to the War on Terror, had many illegitimate supporters, by which is the constant function of the war racket generated by the Confederacy, which is the active parasite seeking to censor, control, restrain, obstruct, and paralyze the United States functions in its interests for the United States public to restrain the government under law and develop it in the interest of America as a collective in the immediate and future and exponential future for the stability and prosperity of the prosperity. Now, the development of these wars are assumed to have been actively subverted by the information David would have acquired as a legal character in the study of the secrets, in the secret missions, in the subversion of the insurrectionists, active sabotage of the United States, which would have developed these various wars and subversions and false flags and the general crimes in order to actively deceive the United States public and all others, qualifies the active mechanism and purpose to resource the Confederacy against the Americans. Now, there are many fiefdoms inside the feudalist structure under the wizard construct of the Confederacy, which is actively protected by secrets by the function of its criminal activities, qualifying its subversion of the United States, which are obstructed by the secrets, so their obstruction of justice by the use of the secrets distraction qualifies the largest threat to national security in American history. These white nationalists and other hate group function as the perpetual thorn in the general public's side, which has actively generated many of the subversions, such as, if I'm to think about it, a brief overview would include a support of Flint, Michigan's water issue, as well as the BP explosion, which the records suggest that the Confederates set up as a bomb as opposed to an actual breaking naturally from the use of overpressure in a non-external mechanism. The use of a bomb in the guarantee of the BP subversion is added on top of the espionage use of secret powers in order to subvert them, and exponentially increasing the rate on which they would have to develop their entire proceedings in order to create cover stories to distract from their terrorist attack against the function in order to extort a larger agenda which would be obstructed from the public view, such as the delays after the explosion from the bombs against the cleanup, which the government, having an obligation to side with BP against the insurance agencies, which are specifically hired under the direct mechanism in order to fund through the bonds of the insurance the cleanup of the oil spill, refused to do so and were protected in the refusal of doing so over double talk, which were protected by the magic mechanisms in order to subvert national security and engage in the exponential reproduction of the problem in the oil spill, in which case they had active developments such as the use of obligations and speeches and qualifiers and distractions and red tape and every kind of thing that would be generated in order to exponentially increase the damages from these attacks, which they specifically believed that the character for David BOLES, being general and having deep studies of the secrets, would have subverted, including the mechanisms of his own insurance function in the waste disposal of the oil, qualifying its redirection and refinement inside the United States under his proceedings and properties in the development and technologies and sciences which he would have actively been developing in his energy schemes, qualifying the transfer of the United States from oil and gas into more sustainable energies, which would actively be invested into a reasonable manner, as opposed to the function of the communist ecosystem terrorists, which pretend to be green. Now, this false green party qualifies their engagement of large changes as to exponentially cause the public to suffer, which would cause them to functionally retaliate or justify absolute suppression. Now, the qualifier of the absolute suppression into exponential tyranny qualifies their support of the communist insurrection against the United States as a fiefdom under the Confederate feudalist system, and these Confederate wizards are going to accept these alternative contracts if it so goes in those directions, qualifying the threat to national security by the refusal to restrain them, uncensor the relevant data, and publish it to the record. Publishing their criminally censored information qualifies the obligation of the courts to enforce the American law and national security against the insurrectionist Confederacy, which has pretended national security when it intends that it's Confederate security and not American security. Their qualifier to the engagement of the subversion is always going to protect the parasite against the host, to the exponential injury to the international community. Now, the developments would ultimately come into larger schemes, such as their espionage plan in order to subvert and destroy the European nations, qualifying their assumption of the character of David Boles, certifying his mechanisms as an American general and other mechanisms not to be disclosed, would become the savior of Europe by the subversion of these espionage terrorist attacks. With the subversion of the destruction of Europe and its restabilizing under the mechanisms of his agreements and treaties and developments, qualifies David as the necessary to national security of all relevant countries, which is the exponential majority of the United States and the world, qualifying every country in the world being reasonably on a list of nations that need David Boles to be fully restored and his enemies to be completely dismantled as a subject of their own national security and survival of their societies against the insurrectionist Confederacy, which, being primarily a racist function, their primary law is their constitution of magic, which is the function of bigotry through the mechanism of fraud, and the mechanism of fraud covered by secrets qualifies the only real offense being the challenging of secrets. There are two primary constitutional issues understood for the Confederacy wizards. Number one is the qualifier of slavery without cause as a moral good for their wizard religion. Now, the qualifier of the second is the protection of the magic system, and the protection of the magic system certifies two basic concepts. The first basic concept is weakness is criminal, and the second is that strength is criminal, and everyone that doesn't challenge the mechanism of the general magic system is the normal function of the Confederacy wizards. David Boles, being convicted of being too amazing in every conceivable fashion, has utterly devastated their entire concept, triggering this violation of their superior law in him being too powerful in order for them to engage in their magic system as a threat to them as a superior power. They collectively retaliated against the estimate, qualifying their poison scripts to be enforced in their brutal nature against David Boles and the Americans, which have been projected to be necessary to American security, such as the projected American leaders that would have been voted in from the algorithms in the military intelligence from their programs, which are currently being obstructed and should be uncensored and published for the public consumption for the enforcement of American law and interests. There are many other activities which would be necessary to uncensor, and the missions being in a undetermined amount and ultimately undisclosable qualifies a few mechanisms that clearly have to be uncensored. A very major one off the top of my head, which should probably be looked into more deeply, is the qualifier of Social Security being used for war bonds, which is functionally illegal, which was passed by everyone in the legislature, including the threat against Bill Clinton, under the threat that if he had vetoed them, that they would subvert it in the Senate, which would require us to engage in the full investigation on the entire due diligence of David Bull's title and side effects, qualifying how much of the Senate he would have replaced and or convicted of being Confederate double agents. The qualifier of these mechanisms certifies the results that would be legitimately referred to as the legal verdict or the actual final answer for the United States, which they have actively assumed and have systematically subverted in their Confederate loyalties, observing the secret functions and their dog whistle terrorist policies specifically designed to defeat the mechanism of American interests through these systems, at which point the question of whether or not it would have worked is to be investigated and disclosed at a later date, at which point the assumption that it would have still happened qualifies the belief that by the time David Bull's character would have been 35, he would have started buying these federal social programs, such as Social Security, in order to redeem a falling trust, in order to subvert the irresponsibility of the legislator, which, having been traumatized by Confederate traitors, such as the intelligence agencies, which have 7 ways of Sunday to getting back at you, would qualify them as being traumatized and thus unsober and thus unqualified in order to pass legislation. And in these traumatizing engagements of those terrorist subversions and distractions as to affect their sobriety, we would have to engage in the corrections and alternatives, which mostly would have to be secrets and thus not public information, on how the subversion of the intelligence confederacy would have been defeated by the American secret functions and securities, primarily assumed through David Bull's character as a top-ranked general in the United States military of undisclosed specifics for the secret defeat of America's enemies. And with the generation of American security from these mechanisms, you would have a completely different series of events qualifying the development, such as their assumption of reparations. Now, David's character wasn't assumed to compensate for reparations, but he was assumed to be a part of a system, such as through his dad, who would have created a bunch of reports to submit to the Congress on how to engage in this, and David's character was assumed to respect the shadow accounts of those claiming obstructed contracts, such as in those arrangements, qualifying their ability to educate themselves to return to their original obstructed contracts in a qualified, sober, educated manner, certifying their ability to generate this, given the mechanisms of them following the schedule specifically designed as to certify the legitimacy of him purchasing the debts of the injury from their obstructions. Now, the qualifier of this certifies the obligation to the development of a Confederate state by which to engage in the fines and liabilities against many of these scenarios, qualifying their ability to collect from an actual cognitive group, such as an actual formal nation, which has to be reformed and prosecuted and functioned in the sentencing for the paying of these liabilities and many of the other liabilities which they would have been guilty of and subversive of the United States function, qualifying the alternative nation and the alternative economy, certifying our protection away from the infection of the Confederacy, which is fundamentally bigot magic for slavery, qualifying their relative need for a tiered system, which is necessary to the use of magic for people to receive the injury. They have to be subject and vulnerable to the illusion, not being able to understand the science behind the trick. They have to obstruct the necessary information, qualifying the actual justification of it as a real scientific thing that would have happened in real life, as opposed to an act of God, which is the general assumption of the purpose of the presentation of the use of magic in a non-entertaining manner. The qualifiers of this is, in summary, an international terrorist threat for exponential international damages. Every single day David Bowles is restrained from his schedule is an exponential international tragedy, qualifying, in many cases, reasonable to assume unrecoverable injuries, qualifying the permanent damages as a side effect of his absence, certifying the exponential threat, refusing to secure American security by the uncensoring and publishing and enforcing of the American interest against the insurrectionist Confederacy, qualifies them as a threat to every man, woman, and child today and in its posterity for all times, forever and ever. Amen.